I was leaning against the kitchen counter, absent-mindedly stirring a steaming cup of coffee, when the quiet of the night was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It was nearly midnight, and the whole house seemed to hold its breath in the darkness, barely lit by the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. She entered the room slowly, almost cautiously, as if she had a secret to share, but was unsure if she dared to. My half-brother's stepsister, or just my stepsister, as everyone casually called her, stopped a few feet from me, her face partially obscured in shadow, but her eyes were fixed on me with an intensity I couldn't place. The sudden stillness weighed heavy between us. We'd crossed paths 100 times in this house since our parents had married, always exchanging friendly jokes or meaningless conversation about school, work, or whatever. Other light topics came to mind, but this was different. Sitting unspoken and electric filled the space, creating a tension I couldn't shake off, even as I tried to force myself to look away. Then she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper, breaking the silence like glass. "We need to talk," she said, her tone softer and more serious than I'd ever heard before. She was fidgeting with her hands, twisting her fingers together as if she was still trying to gather the courage to continue. The words came out reluctantly, almost painfully, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her this vulnerable. There was no easy smile, no usual banter in her eyes, only an uncertainty that seemed to tremble in the dim light. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at her, not sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, laugh at the awkwardness of it all, but something in her expression held me back. It was as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to take a leap, and all she needed was a little nudge. It was shocking, surreal even, and I could feel my heart pick up speed as the reality of the moment sank in. I wasn't prepared for this, whatever this was. "What's going on?" I finally asked, managing to keep my voice steady despite the growing tension. I knew my question was probably pointless. The look on her face told me that this was something big, something that had been building up for longer than I could have guessed. And as I waited, I noticed a subtle tremor in her hand, a hesitation that somehow made the moment feel even more intense. For a few seconds, she didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to the floor, her lips pressing together as if the words were lodged deep within, resisting any attempt to break free. And then with a soft exhale, she met my eyes again. Her stare was piercing, almost pleading, and I could feel an invisible weight pressed down on my chest. "There's something I need to tell you." She began, her voice so low it was barely audible. The way she said it, the quiet urgency in her tone, sent a shiver through me. I was used to seeing her as a friend, someone I'd grown comfortable with over time. But the vulnerability in her expression was something new, something that made me want to reach out and reassure her, even though I had no idea what she was going through. I forced myself to stay still, to not jump to any conclusions, but the atmosphere around us was thick with unspoken words. I could feel myself getting pulled into the gravity of her confession, even though I still didn't know what she wanted to say. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of past conversations, looking for any hint, any clue that might explain why she was so visibly shaken. But I came up empty. In the silence that stretched between us, I felt my own breath catch, my heart drumming steadily in my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but words escaped me. Instead, I just nodded, trying to show her that I was listening, that I was there, even if I didn't fully understand. Finally, she took a hesitant step closer, her gaze unwavering. "I've been holding on to this for a while now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and it's been tearing me up inside. I don't know if I should even be saying this," but her voice trailed off, and for a second I thought she might walk away, leave me here with 1,000 unanswered questions. But then she took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for whatever was about to come next. She paused again, her gaze intense, her expression guarded yet vulnerable, a strange combination that made it impossible to look away. The words that finally left her lips hit me harder than I could have anticipated, their impact rippling through me like a sudden gust of wind. "I think I have feelings for you," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The shock of her words hung in the air, filling the silence with an intensity I couldn't ignore. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of her words, even as I tried to dive into work and push everything to the back of my mind. She'd confessed feelings I'd never seen coming, emotions that twisted our connection into something I couldn't quite define. And even hours later, the tension hung around me like a shadow. Around midday, I was sprawled across the couch, phone pressed to my ear, my friend on the other end filling the silence with updates about his latest project. I nodded along, barely registering half of what he was saying, but then she walked into the room, her expression softened by an amused, almost mischievous smile. I kept my eyes on her, captivated, even as I struggled to pay attention to my friend's voice. She sat beside me, just close enough that I could feel her presence, and before I knew it, her fingers reached over, darting around my sides in quick teasing movements. I jolted, trying to stifle a laugh as her fingers found the ticklish spots I'd long tried to pretend didn't exist. I half shrugged her away, mumbling a strained "hang on, just talking to someone," while trying to keep a straight face. Her laughter was quiet, her gaze sparkling as if she knew the exact effect she was having. She kept at it, relentless, her fingers light and playful, making it nearly impossible for me to focus on anything else. I finally gave in, laughing under my breath as I mowed to silent stop that she promptly ignored. Her eyes met mine, holding my gaze with a sense of familiarity that felt like a dangerous line, one I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. By the time I managed to say goodbye to my friend and hang up, my heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit. I turned to her, a mix of frustration and amusement in my voice. "You know I was on the phone, right?" I said, half joking, half trying to mask the rush of emotions I couldn't explain. She tilted her head, her gaze steady, a smirk playing on her lips. "Couldn't resist," she replied softly, her voice so casual, yet there was something behind her words that hinted at the conversation we'd had the night before. The air between us grew charged again, and I felt the shift, that same unmistakable tension I'd felt when she first walked into the room yesterday, the same awareness that pulled me in and left me questioning where this was all going. She didn't pull back. Instead, she stayed close, her gaze never wavering, her hand lingering on my arm just a second longer than necessary. And then, without thinking, I leaned in, barely aware of the fact that I was closing the distance between us until our faces were only inches apart. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding in those few seconds. This was the moment to pull back, to laugh it off, to say something that would dissolve the intensity between us. But I couldn't. I was caught, suspended between the choice of turning away or giving in, and before I could even process the decision, our lips met in a brief, soft kiss that seemed to silence every doubt, every reason I'd held on to for why this shouldn't happen. It wasn't a kiss full of promises or bold declarations. It was tentative, as if we were both testing the waters, feeling our way around this strange, uncharted territory. Her breath mingled with mine, and for that split second the world felt smaller, quieter, like there was nothing outside of this room, nothing beyond the two of us. The reality of what we'd done lingered in the air between us, a silent confession neither of us was willing to speak out loud. When we finally pulled back, she looked at me, her cheeks slightly flushed, her expression a mix of uncertainty and something else I couldn't quite place. I searched her face, trying to find the words, but they were lost somewhere between the thrill of the moment and the awareness of what we'd just crossed into. "We probably shouldn't have done that," I mumbled, the words barely audible, almost as if I was convincing myself more than her. My pulse was still racing, the sensation of her lips pressed to mine fresh, as if it were an imprint I couldn't shake off. She looked away, a faint smile tugging at her lips, her voice barely a murmur. "Probably not," she agreed, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing the edge of the couch cushion. For a moment, neither of us moved, trapped in the weight of what had just happened. And yet I couldn't ignore the unspoken understanding that lingered in her gaze, a silent admission that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of it. The silence between us felt charged, like we were standing on the edge of something big, something that had been building up longer than either of us had realized. I felt torn, wanting to pull her close again, yet knowing that every step deeper into this would complicate things in ways I wasn't prepared to face. Finally, she looked at me, the corners of her lips lifting in a small, almost teasing, "Well, guess you'll have to get used to me being around," she said, a hint of playfulness in her voice. Yet her eyes held a seriousness that sent another jolt through me. There was no telling what would happen next. But in that moment, as we sat there so close, yet so uncertain, I knew there was no going back to how things were. We'd crossed a line, and the only question now was whether we were ready to face the consequences. In the days that followed, it felt like everything had shifted. And yet we both acted as if nothing unusual had happened. We were careful, treading lightly, careful not to bring up the kiss that hung unspoken between us. Yet the memory of it lingered, catching me off guard in quiet moments, making me second guess every look, every smile. I found myself watching her more closely, noticing small things I'd somehow missed before, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear, the quick smirk she'd give when she thought no one was watching, the way her laugh softened whenever I was around. I knew it was ridiculous to be thinking about her like this, but I couldn't stop myself. Anytime we were in the same room, the air grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension. I'd catch her glancing my way, and sometimes our eyes would meet, lingering just a second, too long before one of us looked away, and though I tried to ignore it, I could tell she felt it too. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, she strolled into the kitchen with an easy, familiar grin. She leaned against the counter, watching me chop vegetables, and for a moment, everything felt oddly normal. There was something comforting in her presence, as if we'd settled into a silent agreement to let things be. But as I turned to grab a bowl, I noticed her reaching for the can of whipped cream I'd a can, set aside for dessert. I raised an eyebrow, amused. Seriously, that's for later, I said, knowing full well she'd ignore me. She just laughed, a playful spark lighting up her eyes. Couldn't resist, she said with a shrug, pressing the nozzle and letting a small mountain of cream land on her finger before taking a quick taste. Besides, she continued, glancing up at me, "You know I have a weakness for this stuff." I couldn't help but roll my eyes, even though a grin tugged at my lips. She was so unabashed, so confidently herself, that it was impossible to stay annoyed. "One day I'm going to make you wait," I teased, pointing the spoon in her direction, "or I might just stop sharing." She took a step closer, eyes narrowing with a mock challenge. "Oh, please," she said, laughing. "You'd never make it." Her tone was light, playful, but there was something about the way she looked at me that made me hesitate. A barely there pause between us as the memory of our last kiss resurfaced. I swallowed, trying to shake off the feeling, but the tension only grew thicker. She turned, settling on a bar stool across the island, and started chatting about her bar day, filling the space with light-hearted stories. I listened, half-focused, yet fully aware of how close she was, how her presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. Her laughter echoed around us, somehow magnified in this small space, and the casual nature of it felt like a sharp contrast to the weight of my thoughts. Then, out of nowhere, she reached across the counter, lightly touching my arm. Her fingers brushed my skin for just a second, but it was enough to send a ripple through me, a reminder of everything left unsaid. She pulled her hand back quickly, but I saw the slight blush rising to her cheeks, and I knew she felt it too. I tried to act casual, stirring the sauce on the stove, but I could feel her watching me, her gaze burning into my back. Finally, I set the spoon down and turned to face her, unable to ignore the tension any longer. She looked up, caught off guard, and for a second we just stared at each other, both of us too hesitant to make the first move. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat louder than the last, filling the silence between us. "Are we just not going to talk about it?" I asked, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The words slipped out before I had a chance to stop them, but once they were out, I couldn't take them back. Her expression softened, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know," she admitted, a small, almost sad smile forming on her lips. "Maybe it's better if we don't." I wanted to argue, to tell her that pretending nothing had happened wasn't the answer, but I couldn't find the right words. Instead, I just nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. She turned her attention back to the whipped cream, taking another small taste, as if savoring the sweetness was enough to distract her from the growing tension. In that moment, I realized just how complicated things had become. We were dancing around something fragile, something that could break at any moment if we weren't careful. And yet there was a part of me that didn't want to be careful. I wanted to let the tension build, to see where it would take us, even if it meant risking everything. As we finished dinner, the atmosphere seemed to settle, though the unspoken words still hung between us. She kept glancing my way, her smile lingering a little too long, her laugh a little too bright, and I found myself leaning into it, letting her warmth fill the space between us as if that could somehow make things simpler. After that evening, as I was cleaning up, she wandered back into the kitchen, looking almost sheepish. "Thanks for letting me eat half the dessert," she said with a grin, her eyes bright with a mischievous sparkle. "I owe you," I shrugged, unable to stop the smile that crept onto my face. "You can owe me another time," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though I knew the weight of what lay beneath. She nodded, her gaze flicking to the ground, and for a brief moment I thought she might say something, but instead she just whispered a soft good night and turned to leave, her steps barely audible against the floor. As she disappeared down the hall, the silence closed in, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The memory of her laughter and the bittersweet taste of everything left unsaid. A few days later, we found ourselves alone again. This time it was on a brisk autumn evening, with leaves falling from the trees around us swirling in gentle breezes that cut through the silence. We were supposed to be helping with an errand, some family commitment neither of us wanted to attend, but we'd both conveniently slipped away, finding an empty park bench under a street lamp that cast a soft glow. The air was sharp and clear, the kind that seems to breathe life into buried emotions, and I could feel that familiar tension beginning to settle over us again. It was impossible to ignore, as much as we both tried to act casual. She was talking about something trivial, a recent movie she'd watched maybe, or some story about a friend, her voice laced with a forced lightness that betrayed her. I nodded along, responding automatically, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment we'd shared over the past weeks, all the things we'd left unsaid. I could feel her eyes on me as she spoke, her gaze intense, like she was waiting for something, though I couldn't say what. Eventually the words trailed off, leaving only the quiet hum of the evening around us. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, fidgeting with her scarf as if she was uncomfortable, and I knew we were both thinking about the same thing. The silence between us grew heavier, thick with unspoken words, and I could feel my heart pounding, that familiar rhythm of anticipation and fear. After what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and finally spoke, breaking the quiet that had enveloped us. "Look, about everything that's been happening," I began, my voice sounding more uncertain than I'd intended. "We can't keep ignoring it." Her gaze dropped to the ground, her face softening. She looked almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to her usual confidence, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt, like I was pushing her into a corner. But then she looked up, meeting my eyes with a steady resolve I hadn't expected. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know what to do about it either." There was a sadness in her tone, a sense of helplessness that mirrored my own. "Maybe it's better if we just pretend nothing happened," she added, though there was no conviction in her words. I shook my head, feeling a rush of frustration. "How can we pretend?" I asked, my voice growing louder. Whatever this is, it's real. We can't just sweep it under the rug and pretend it doesn't matter." My words hung in the air, harsh against the quiet night, and I immediately regretted the edge in my tone. She flinched, her expression hardening. "Do you think I haven't thought about that?" She shot back, her voice tinged with frustration. "Do you think I don't know how complicated this is?" Her words hit me, and I took a step back, feeling the weight of everything we'd been carrying. The hurt in her eyes made me realize just how deeply we were both affected by this, how we'd been trying to ignore something that refused to be buried. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield against the cold, though I knew it wasn't just the chill in the air that made her shiver. For a moment, she looked like she was going to walk away, to put an end to this. But then she turned back, her gaze softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen it. Maybe we just need to be honest," she murmured, her voice barely audible, no more. Pretending. The vulnerability in her words broke through my own defenses, and before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. Her breath caught as I reached out, my hand finding hers, our fingers intertwining in a way that felt both new and familiar. The space between us dissolved, leaving only the warmth of her hand in mine, the quiet intimacy of the moment. And then, without a word, I leaned in, our lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle, almost hesitant, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this fragile connection. It was nothing like our first kiss. This time it felt grounded, real, as if we were finally acknowledging the truth we'd both been running from. Her lips were soft, warm against mine, and I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, a steady rhythm that matched my own. We pulled away slowly, our foreheads resting together, neither of us willing to break the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. This is a mess, isn't it?" She laughed softly, the sound tinged with both sadness and relief, and I felt a faint smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah," I replied, my voice equally soft, "but maybe it doesn't have to be." The words felt both comforting and uncertain, like a promise we weren't sure we could keep. For a while, we stayed like that, lost in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. It was as if the world around us had faded, leaving only the two of us in this small, stolen moment. But eventually, reality began to creep back in, reminding us of the impossibility of what we were doing. She pulled away slightly, her gaze distant. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice filled with a sadness that tugged at my chest. "It's too complicated. People would never understand." I wanted to argue, to tell her that we could make it work, but the words caught in my throat. I knew she was right. No matter how much I wanted to believe we could find a way, the obstacles were too great, the risks too high, and yet I couldn't bring myself to let her go. "I don't have all the answers," I admitted, my voice quiet, "but I know that I don't want to lose this." "Lose you?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. For a moment I thought she might say something that would make all of this make sense, but instead she just sighed, a soft, resigned sound that cut through me like a knife. "We'll figure it out," she said, though her tone was laced with uncertainty. "Or maybe we won't." She laughed bitterly, the sound hollow, and I could feel the weight of her doubts settling over us like a heavy cloud. The night air grew colder, a sharp reminder of the reality we couldn't escape. We were standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. As she looked at me, her expression a mixture of hope and fear, I felt the weight of what we were risking, the fragile nature of the connection we were trying to hold on to. In that moment, I wanted to tell her everything, how much she meant to me, how much I wanted to make this work. But instead, I just reached out, taking her hand once more, offering what little comfort I could. "Whatever happens," I said, my voice steady, "we'll face it together." Her grip tightened around my hand, and for a moment it felt like that was enough. But as we stood there, wrapped in the quiet of the night, I knew that the hardest part was still ahead. It wasn't long before our parents suggested a family getaway, one of those impulsive ideas where they imagined we'd all reconnect and make memories together, free from daily obligation. I knew we couldn't refuse without raising suspicion, so we agreed. The idea of spending an entire weekend together, confined within the same house, felt like both a blessing and a burden. I told myself we'd keep our distance, make it through without letting our guard down, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The weekend began on an awkward note. The house was a cozy, secluded cabin near a lake, its rustic charm casting a quiet stillness over us that only heightened the tension. The first night we all sat together, our parents laughing, reminiscing about stories we'd heard 1,000 times. She and I exchanged polite glances, keeping the familiar distance we'd practiced over the past few days, but I couldn't help catching her gaze every so often. I saw the same hesitance, the same pull that kept bringing us back to each other, and I knew she felt it too. The second day was filled with activities designed to bring us closer together, according to our parents. By mid-afternoon, we'd hiked through the nearby woods, played board games by the fire, and shared more forced laughter than I thought possible. The strain of keeping things normal was exhausting. The tension simmered under every word, every glance. She stayed close to our parents, her laughter genuine enough to fool them, but every so often I'd catch a glimpse of something in her eyes that told me she was just as on edge as I was. That evening, after dinner, we managed to sneak away, retreating to the quiet shadows of the garden just outside the cabin. The air was crisp and smelled of pine, and the night was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just stood there side by side, watching the sky darken and the stars blink into view. I took a deep breath, breaking the silence. "This weekend's been harder than I thought it would be." She nodded, her gaze distant, a faint crease in her brow. "I thought I could handle it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But every time I look at you, it's like I can't breathe. It's as if I don't know who I am anymore when I'm around you." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I reached out, my fingers brushing against hers, a tentative touch that felt as fragile as the moment itself. "Maybe we're just trying too hard to pretend," I said softly, hoping that somehow saying it out loud would make it easier. She turned to face me, her expression torn between the same mix of emotions I felt. "But what else can we do? This isn't something we can explain away. And every time I try to act normal, I feel like I'm betraying myself. And you?" Her gaze was steady, her eyes reflecting the dim light from the cabin, and I knew Sheeta was as trapped in this as I was. Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps approaching from the cabin made us pull apart. Instantly, our conversation cut short as we retreated back to our roles, putting on masks of casual indifference. The moment was gone, and with it, the brief comfort of honesty we'd shared. Later that night, everyone turned in early, exhausted from the day's activities. I tried to sleep, lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling and feeling the weight of everything left unsaid. My mind was a mess, replaying every glance, every whispered word we'd exchanged. I knew I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep walking this line between desire and denial. But the reality of our situation loomed like a dark shadow, reminding me that whatever choice we made, there would be consequences. Just when I thought I'd spend the entire night wrestling with my thoughts, I heard a soft knock at my door. I held my breath, knowing who it was before I even opened it. She stood there, silhouetted in the dim hallway light, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. We both knew why she was there, why we couldn't keep pretending. I let her in, closing the door softly behind us. But for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in the faint light. The unspoken tension between us hung thick in the air, and I could feel my pulse quick in as I took in the reality of her presence. She stepped closer, and in that small space it was as if the world narrowed down to just the two of us, the unspoken understanding that this was a point of no return. Without thinking, I reached for her, our hands finding each other, fingers intertwining. It felt like relief. It finally surrendered to something we'd been fighting for too long. She looked up at me, her gaze steady, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. And then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, she leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that held everything we hadn't said. Every moment we'd kept hidden. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was calm, like we were both finally accepting the truth that had been between us from the beginning. Her warmth, her closeness felt like an anchor, grounding me in a way that made everything else fade away. For a brief, stolen moment, it was just us, free from the world outside, from the doubts and fears that had kept us apart. When we finally pulled back, she looked at me, her eyes filled with both hope and sadness. She didn't say anything, and she didn't need to. The look in her eyes spoke louder than any words could. This was real, but it was also impossible. We both knew that even as we stood there, holding on to each other in the quiet darkness, eventually she stepped back, her fingers slipping from mine, and I felt a pang of loss as the distance grew between us again. She offered a faint, bitter, sweet smile, and I knew she was feeling the same weight, the same inevitability that hung over us. There was no going back, and yet moving forward seemed just as impossible. "Good night," she whispered, her voice barely audible, and before I could respond, she turned and left, the soft click of the door echoing in the silence. As I stood there, alone in the quiet of the room, the reality of what had happened settled over me, heavy and unyielding. We'd crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased or ignored. I knew deep down that there would be no easy answers, no way to undo the choices we'd made. What I could do was hope that somehow we'd find a way to face what lay ahead, even as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on us like a storm cloud waiting to break. For the first time, I realized that love, no matter how powerful, didn't always come with clear paths or happy endings. Sometimes it was just a series of impossible choices, leaving us to pick up the pieces of what we'd broken along the way. Returning to the city felt strange, as if the world had shifted and left us stranded between reality and everything we'd left unsaid. Days passed, and each one stretched thin with distance. We'd crossed a line that weekend, a boundary I thought might bring us closer, but it seemed to have pushed us into silence. The weight of what we'd done and everything we hadn't addressed lingered, thickening the air each time we met, even in passing. I wanted to talk to her, to make sense of this strange limbo where we now found ourselves, but she seemed distant, her gaze slipping away each time I tried to catch it. She looked at me with something new in her expression, something unreadable. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't the warmth I'd grown used to either. She was pulling away, and I felt it like a loss, each day widening the space between us. One evening, when I couldn't stand the silence any longer, I texted her, asking if we could talk. Hours passed without a response. Finally, around midnight, my phone lit up with a message. It was short and to the point, her tone colder than I expected. "Meet me by the river." The river had always been a quiet spot for us, somewhere we'd often walk during late-night talks, discussing everything from dreams to family and everything in between. But tonight it felt different. The night air was sharp, and the world seemed shrouded in stillness as I waited alone under the faint glow of the street lamps reflecting off the water. I saw her approaching, her steps slow, almost hesitant, and I felt a rush of anticipation, mingled with something close to fear. She stopped a few feet away, hands buried in her pockets, her gaze fixed on the ground. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she looked up, her face shadowed, her eyes searching mine. The silence felt like a chasm, too wide to bridge. "We need to stop this," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the sound of the river flowing beside us. Her words hit me like a blow, and I felt my chest tighten, a hollow ache settling in. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady but sad. "This, whatever it is between us, it's not something we can keep doing. I thought we could find a way, but it's just too much for both of us." I shook my head, feeling a surge of frustration and desperation. "We don't have to end it. We could figure it out somehow. I don't want to just pretend none of this happened." She looked away, her expression hardening. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're both just clinging to something we shouldn't be." Her voice was sharp, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed her. I stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. The distance between us felt insurmountable, an invisible wall she'd built brick by brick, and I felt powerless to break it. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I could, but it's tearing me apart. We're hurting ourselves and each other." Her eyes shimmered with something raw, an emotion she was barely holding back. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to argue, to tell her that we could make it work, that what we had was worth fighting for, but her expression told me she'd already made up her mind. She looked at me as though she'd come to terms with something I hadn't yet accepted, and that realization was like a knife twisting in my chest. "Is this really what you want?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, swallowing hard, though her eyes betrayed her. "It's what we need," she replied, her tone resolute. "We can't keep pretending this won't destroy us." There was a finality in her words that made it hard to breathe. I felt the weight of everything we'd shared pressing down on me, the memories, the stolen moments, the nights spent in whispered conversations. And now, standing here, it all seemed to slip away like sand through my fingers, leaving only the ache of what could have been. "I don't know how to let you go," I admitted, my voice breaking, the vulnerability I'd tried so hard to hide spilling out in those few simple words. She gave a sad smile, the kind that spoke of regret and understanding. "Maybe we don't have a choice." Her words hung in the air, final and irreversible, and I knew she was right, even as my heart rebelled against it. She took a step back, the distance between us widening, her expression resolute yet heartbreaking. And just as she turned to leave, she looked back, her gaze lingering as if she wanted to remember me in that moment, to capture something of what we'd shared before it slipped away completely. As she walked away, the reality of it all settled over me, a hollow ache filling the space she'd left behind. I stood there, the night air cold against my skin, watching her figure fade into the darkness, feeling as though I was losing a part of myself. In the silence that followed, I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said, the choices we hadn't made, and I wondered if this was how it was always meant to end. With words unspoken, a path untaken, the memory of her touch, her voice lingered in the air, a ghost of what we'd had, and as I turned to leave, a question echoed in my mind, haunting and relentless. Was it better to have loved and lost her, or had we been foolish to believe we could rewrite the boundaries that had always been there? The answer slipped away as elusive as she had become, leaving me to wonder if love, in all its beauty and pain, was ever meant to be ours to keep.